Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing? I'm Philip Osteen, Dean of the College of Social Work here at the University of Utah. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our next Social Work Beyond the Classroom presentation. As the name suggests, these presentations allow us to delve into the work that engages our faculty outside of their teaching responsibilities and allows us to share the research that's happening here with members of the community, our former students, our graduates, anybody who can access us either in person or online. We welcome all of our attendees, those of you here in person, as well as those of you who are online, those of you who are here in the live making of today's video, and those who are going to watch it at another time. I also want to sincerely thank everyone who donated while registering. These donations will support Officers Hollow, which is a really big Halloween event that we do here in the college. We bring in hundreds of kids from across the valley, and it helps our students gain organizing experience. So thank you so much for those donations. Last time I checked, there was over $400 worth of Halloween candy, so we're pretty excited about that. Sorry to all the parents. Before we get to today's presentation, on behalf of the College of Social Work, I want to recognize our American Indian community members by acknowledging that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is a traditional ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the endearing relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples in their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we reaffirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. Today, we are very, very excited to showcase the most recent work of Dr. Martell Teasley, co-editor of the recently released book, Social Work in the Grand Challenge to Eliminate Racism. Last week, we received news of Dr. Teasley's new appointment as the University of Utah's new Associate Provost for Strategic Academic Initiatives. In addition to this role, he will be developing and launching the new Institute on Race, Policy Studies, and Health Equity, which we're very, very grateful to house here in the College of Social Work. Dr. Teasley served as Dean of the University of Utah College of Social Work from 2017 to 2022, as Interim Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs from 2022 to 2023, and for 2 terms as President of the National Associations of Deans and Directors of Schools of Social Work. His previous research primarily focused on social work in school settings, and particularly the vital role that social work can play in advancing educational equity. Prior to coming to the university, he served as the chair of the Department of Social Work in the University of Texas at San Antonio College of Public Policy. His experience also includes employment as a substance use disorder counselor, time as a licensed practical nurse, and a decade of service with the U.S. Army. He earned his PhD in social work from Howard University, and where his scholarship focused on African-American adolescent development. He also holds BSW and bachelor's and master's degree from Fayetteville State University and Virginia Commonwealth University, respectively. So following his presentation, Martell will have about 10 minutes to respond to your questions. If you are online, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen to submit your questions. Are you ready, sir?
Thank you.
With that, you're on.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Dean Osteen. Really nice to be here, the place that I call home in the College of Social Work, a lot of familiar faces. So thanks to students, faculty, staff, and folks online for attending. I've got to shorten that bio, it makes me sound old. I'm only 30 and I did all that stuff. So anyway, this is, this book was a labor of love. Social Work in the Grand Challenge to Eliminate Racism. Worked on it for a couple of years. When I started it, then COVID happened, so that delayed it about a year. And then I got summons to the park building with the central administration. And so every night I would go home and work on this. And then one day my wife said, "Oh, you're coming to bed?" And I go, "Yes." And so one day you click and you're like, "I'm done. I'm actually done." And so, but we saw the light of the end of the tunnel. There are 21 chapters, 572 pages with the notes and indexes. So Oxford University Press. I'll talk a little bit about how that came to be as we start here. So first off, let's see, you see the title, what happened? Oh, goodness. Okay.
Just go ahead and keep talking.
All right. Did I press the wrong thing? Oh, I did. That's what happened. It was me.
Just fine.
Okay. Thank you, Danielle. So here are the objectives for our presentation. We want to talk a little bit about the origins of the Grand Challenge to Eliminate Racism and how that came about. I'll talk about some definitions in the first two chapters. I kind of set the landscape for the book itself. And then I'll provide a real cursory review of the book's content and talk about, a little overview of the book itself. And so some of the projects that are being worked on. Now, you can go to the Grand Challenge of Social Work website, and this is what you'll see here. So initially there were 12 Grand Challenges, and I'm scared. Does this have a pointer? Does this do the infrared thing? Okay, leave it alone. Anyway, there were 12, and you see Eliminate Racism, which was actually the 13th. And the Grand Challenges, when those 12 came out, a group of us got together, some scholars from around the country, all African-American, and said, hey, this thing is missing racism. So someone did an indexing through all 12 Grand Challenges and found out the word racism was just barely mentioned. And so we started petitioning. I started petitioning, and there were a couple of lines of thoughts. One was like, we'll weave racism throughout the Grand Challenges, and it doesn't need a standalone category. And then there were those of us saying, no, we need to talk about what I refer to as the centrality of racism. That is, racism itself as a causal factor in the lives of people. And that's why this needs to be a standalone Grand Challenge. They disagreed with me, made a lot of noise. Then March 20th, I believe, of 2001 happened, George Floyd. I got an email from the Grand Challenge Executive Committee saying, okay, move forward. So somehow people started believing racism really happened then. To my chagrin. But anyway, this was the 13th Grand Challenge. Now, there's a movement now, and I need to talk to some folks because they're like, why is it 13? I have zero problem with it being 13. You know why? The United States had 13 slaveholding colonies. Okay, and then it was the 13th Amendment that made racism illegal. And if you notice or not, Dr. King's reign as a civil rights leader was 13 years. And this book came out on June 13th. So 13, I'm fine with it, okay? Not a problem whatsoever. Okay, so this is the first statement in the book that I wrote. Racism is a grand challenge for the social work profession because the profession has never tackled the centrality of racism as a causal factor precipitating problem formation in the lives of people. And in chapter 2, I go through the history of social work, and I talk about why we really haven't tackled racism as a profession, and we say we advocate for social justice. And part of it is, rightfully so, we talked about cultural competency, we talked about multiculturalism, we talked about intersectionality, that's fine. But those are easier conversations than a conversation about race. So I'm really not surprised that we have like 150 something people, because people want to hear about race. And they actually want to not that I don't want to attack the audience, but they love to hear racial faux pas, that you do something stupid. Not here. I often would say when I was in class, I talk hard, but I don't talk about hate. And there's a lot of silliness out there. Maybe we can talk about that too. But that's what the book focuses on. And so when I talk to the authors who are writing the chapters, we talked about solution-focused things to problems, because there's a lot of literature out there about the problems of racism. And so I sent some initial proposals back saying, hey, this is just a diatribe about race. I want some solutions. And some of it was, and then everybody wanted to go through the history of racism. And it's like, no, we've got a chapter on that. So let's make it current. But it turned out to be really good. So race as a social construct. This is one I wanted to put up in terms of explaining definitions to you, because you can see, as we're saying there, that key to understanding race as a concept is the alignment of social values within the cultural context and the symbolic meaning of physical features. Now, race is a social construct. Ethnicity is socially constructed as a way of grouping people. And so it talks about people's national origin, their language, their culture, their religion. So I'm an African American. That means I kind of like 1 foot in Africa, 1 foot here in America. We have Italian Americans, we have Jewish Americans. So people, that's why race is used as a nomenclature there. But the thing about race as a social construct is really problematic when we just say, you know, race is just a social construct, it has no meaning. And that's really problematic to me. Let me read from a statement I have in the book by one of the quotes, and this is from Maulana Karenga, and he says, "To say that race is specious is to deny the reality of it in its social embrace and social consequences. Indeed, it is important to remember that concepts are not simply real and imaginary, but descriptions of reality, for they actually become forms of reality itself when people embrace these ideals and use them to inform, explain, and direct their lives. As such is the history of race and the system for which it is the foundational stone, that is racism." And so race has really meaning to it because we engage into it and we operate off of that in terms of things we do to people. Dean Osteen said, you know, one of my things I've done in my life is I was a licensed practical nurse and I went to nursing school in the military. It was really tough. And I was at Fort Bragg in North Carolina as part of the training. And there was a lieutenant colonel who actually was one of these know-it-all people. And everyone wanted to avoid him because he ran the place. And whenever you would see him, he would ask you one of these crazy questions that you probably couldn't answer, and you'd end up in the library in the weekend writing a paper for him. And so everyone wanted to avoid him. And so one day I ran right into him and I just couldn't avoid him, you know. So I slewed at him and he started a conversation with me. And he goes, "Okay, Sergeant Teasley, what does the hormone erythropoietin do?" I go, "That's easy. It creates bone marrow. It's in the bone marrow and it helps create red blood cells." And he said, "Any 8th grader knows that. Write me a 5-page paper this weekend and bring it in Monday." And so my point is when I hear people say race is just a social construct, any 8th grader knows that. Because racism gets reified into realism. And logicians have something they call existential import, that we make things real. So let's look at unicorns. They're not real, but if we have a uniform, they have a unicorn, they have a horn on them, okay? And so that's how we do race, and we act upon that. So no more 8th grade notions of social constructs of race. In terms of defining racism, we have lots of definitions about racism. Definitions and perceptions of racism are really complex, confusing, contradictory, and controversial and imprecise, mainly because racism itself is fluent and flexible. It changes over time. Lots of people say that to be a racist, you have to have power over a group. It can't be individualized. I don't believe that. I believe as an African-American, could be a racist against anyone in the audience here, so on and so forth, and that it is at the individual level. I think Kende talks about that in his anti-racist text. And so one of the things when I taught, I would put up these different definitions of racism and let students pick them apart in terms of what the terms within the definition meant. And we would go through that. Critical thought about race and racism means a committed study of the fluid and flexible meaning of these concepts within a given social era and or context, and how they are addressed within institutional norms and practices and everyday interpersonal and situational narratives. So we've come a long way. There's certain things we don't do. We don't call women certain things. We don't call people of color certain things, but we still engage in microaggressions. And every now and then we see outright racist behavior from people. And so then that really seems obtuse. But what's happening now are really very what's happening now is more like microaggressions that happen to people, and they're hard to decipher sometimes. So you end up scratching your head. We'll talk about that. Here's more about race as the centrality of race. And so what I say is the centrality of race and racism is based on a central organizing principle in thought, behavior, institutional norms, and practices and policy formation. And so that means that if one is investigating racism, it's how we view and investigate it and examine the structural system and how it operates. And that's a bigger thing. Normally in research, race is used as a dummy variable, a 1 or a 0. And that's really rudimentary. There's an argument within social work about foster care, as many of you probably know. And there's one group saying, of course, African Americans and our Latinx brothers and sisters are disproportionately in foster care systems, as you know. And one camp is saying that's racism. Another camp is saying, no, it's just poverty. If these people had more money, then they wouldn't be in the system. Racism is almost synonymous with poverty. So racism just about equals poverty. If you look at the US Census Bureau and the income of groups, you will see that African Americans are at the bottom. And for every program and practice we've done in this country, African Americans own less than 3% of the wealth, as well as our Hispanic brothers and sisters. And so racism is synonymous with poverty, and our Latinx brothers and sisters have surpassed African Americans in terms of wealth. I say that with a caveat because there are a lot of people that are not counted, that are in the shadows, and we don't know their incomes, but they're certainly not too high. So let's talk about the notion of an anti-racist, which really is someone who supports and adheres to the examining of the centrality of race according to and accordingly prohibiting its perniciousness, effects on policy formation, implementation, and operational continuation. Now, missing from that is that individual piece, because here it again, it's saying policy formation, and lots of people who do anti-racist work say that it is really policy that's affecting us, which is true. But then there is the everyday ordinary in terms of bias and prejudice and bigotry that's impacting people also. And so again, I always include that definition. Now, there's a lot of people out there who have problems with the term of anti-racism and other things that people have done, and they put it under the rubric of woke culture. One, I always tell people as an African-American, I could not be unconscious, so I've always been woke. That's no way to live in America. And two, let's admit to the silliness that's out there that people run into. So I have a good friend who interviewed at a university, and what was said to that person is, what are you going to do about being a white male? Now, that's a horrible thing to say to someone. What can they, how do you change your gender? I'm not getting into that conversation. But how do you change being a male? If you say that's who you are and how you're born. So that is really problematic, and people who do that have some thinking, some critical thinking to do. And so let's not forget that we can call out the silliness, and we can say, because what people do who are against anything about race or any discussion about race, or who say we don't live in a racist society, is point to the silliness. And so what we're seeing recently is putting all this wokeness under an umbrella term: critical race theory, anti-racist theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all that's been signed off because of the browning of America. And I read an interesting stat a few days ago. Most of the 20-somethings in our country are from minority groups. But fear not, my Anglo-American brothers and sisters, because over time, if we look at the history, people have then shifted, what we call white shift, that Today, I'm Hispanic, tomorrow I'm white. I don't know how brown people do that, but there's some people I've met who want to do that, but that's a problem. Or people are afraid because of that. I'll put it that way. And then there's the notion of a race-centered framework. My friend Jerome Shealy, who did an Afrocentric presentation here a couple years ago, talks about a race-centered framework, which places race, as you see italicized there, at the center of social policy analysis. And so, and I have a chart, a model that I'm going to show you, but that's important. That's what's going on in terms of race, in terms of social policy, not as a dummy variable, but what are the actual things that people are experiencing within their community context. The other thing about the centrality of racism is disproportionality. So anytime you're operating, social workers who are out there, any type of clinical folk, or any people dealing with people in general, when you see disproportionate amounts of people in categories, you have to find out why that's happening. So I don't have a problem with saying when I started here as dean, one of the things I saw was the salaries of women, which were lower than men. It was just clear easily, man, woman, man, woman. It was just really clear. And so I go, what's wrong with this? And so we had to do something over time to try to correct some of the salaries. I hope Dean Osteen is still doing that. I don't want to put pressure on you, but we need to do that. I worked in school as a school social worker. And one of the things I had to deal with was disproportionality, because I started to see more Black and brown kids being suspended from school. And so like, what's going on here? And what I found out was, one, we would label kids who are high energy, they'd label them ADHD because they were hyperactive. And I ran groups with kids for a long time. And one of the things I noticed that what we did when we brought the kids in and into school is they would eat copious amounts of fructose and syrup before they came to school. What happens to you if you eat an over amount of sugar? You're bouncing off the walls. And so the group I worked with at Howard University said, these kids are bad. And I said, no, it's us. And they said, why? I said, because we're feeding them all this sugar every morning, and then we're trying to have them sit in rows and columns and be quiet. How about some more nutritious snacks that will get away from that? And that's what we did. Still had some bouncing around, but we had to acknowledge that as a problem. So here comes another thing that I'm big on, this notion of racial common sense thinking, and you can see the definitions there. Really, common sense, whether you know it or not, is not left to chance. We kind of think that, you know, everybody's on the same page of things, and that's part of cultural orientation. Common sense is based on experiences that are reinforced over time through socialization and behavioral modification. It is an extra sense that allows people to make meaning and organize what their senses tell them about the world. People are acculturated on views, values, and practices, and operate in the world based on a set of normative rules from those experiences. Similarly, the normalization of racialized thinking has become so commonplace in America that it serves as a central organizing theme in public life. There that comment goes again, central organizing principle or theme, and provides presuppositions to human relations and interactions, and has been codified through acculturation and socialization. Let me give you a couple examples of that. One, I'll give you a historical one, and I love history. Everyone that knows me knows I read a lot of history. So I read a book on Frederick Douglass, excellent book. And one of the things about 2 years ago by a scholar, and one of the interesting things in there was, as you know, Frederick Douglass interacted with Abraham Lincoln quite often. And so when African Americans were allowed into the Civil War, they initially were not, Frederick Douglass went and complained. And he said, look, we're in the war, we are not getting paid, we don't have shoes, we have old burlap sacks on, and you're putting us in the front line, we're getting shot. And Lincoln quickly retorted, that is the price Black people were paying for being in the Civil War. That's racial common sense thinking, because what it does is it benefits the status quo. in terms of normality of whiteness. Let's look at a more contemporary example, the war on drugs. Remember the whole notion of crack babies, which really didn't exist if we look at the research, and that these crack folk were predatory and we had to give them a higher sentence than people on powder cocaine because they're going to do something evil. And there's still people in jail from that. And then we have an opioid epidemic, where, as I understand, 76 billion opioids were dropped on the American economy between 2006 and 2012. We know that through the FDA, they count all of those. And when we started to see our Anglo-American brothers and sisters, particularly in affluent communities, overdosing, we said, what? This is a medical emergency. And we started to give drugs, naloxone to people. We had a campaign for that here in the university. But you see the difference there. Again, racial common sense thinking. Kind of just flies over our head once. Let me tell you a personal story. So one of my, when I was 12, I was a school social worker. And I worked in a school in Richmond, Virginia. Predominantly Black kids, predominantly white teachers, sprinkled in with a few Black teachers. And one day, a young African-American female, a woman, came into my office and she was quite distraught. She was asked to develop a Black history exhibition for Black History Month. And she said, I don't really know a whole lot about Black history. I went to mainstream schools, and so I don't know much more than the common person, And so she articulated it to me very well. And I said to her, well, let's just go and talk to those teachers who, and just tell them the same thing that you just told me. She was a little afraid, so I said, I'll go in there with you. And so we sat down, we were in a circle doing that kind of social work circle thing, and they were talking, and she got upset, but she did say what? And one of the teachers said, well, Denise, I don't see what all this is about. We let you take your insulin in the room by yourself every day. And you can't be calling us racist. And I go, huh? Can you see the problem there? We let you take insulin every day in a room by yourself? Doesn't the person have a right to do that? She didn't even pick up on that. I was the only one who picked up on that. That's racial common sense thinking. You see? And that happens pervasively. It happens to me. It happens to all of us. So now, when you go to someone and say that's racial common sense thinking, don't park to Martell Teasley. Look up the definition yourself and talk to the person. Last definition on structural racism. Structural racism is created and reinforced through institutional and structural practices, through organizational culture and racial common sense thinking. That is to say, sometimes we say that's the way it's always been in terms of structural inequalities. Now, there's an argument about folks in the mainstream who say, particularly on the political right, that structural inequalities don't really exist. That was the past. If you look at American history, what you're taught, and I was taught, is, we enslaved some people. We had a civil war to forego that. We killed some people. And then we had some problems after that. We had a civil rights movement, and everything's hunky-dory now. So you shouldn't worry about it anymore. And that's not even part of the story. That's a very rudimentary 8th grade approach. Okay. And so you need an in-depth study. I was talking to someone recently about convict leasing, which took place after the Civil War during Jim Crow, and they had never heard the term. There's a huge book. There's a book by a guy named Douglas Blackman called Slavery by Another Name. And you can read that. And he's an Anglo-American. He was a newspaper. He won a Pulitzer Prize for it because what he discovered is that his grandfather was part of convict leasing. And he had leased out African-Americans who would be given jail terms for things like loitering or eating food or not working or taking another job without getting permission from your boss. And then after doing 6 months, they would say, Martell, yes, you've done your 6 months, but we fed you the whole time you were here. And we put clothes on when we gave you a bed. And so you owe us another 6 months. And those type of things, those are the type of things that were taking place. That did not stop until after World War II, when the Germans particularly said, What are you talking about? You can't say we're engaging in genocide and racism. Look what you're doing to African Americans. And then the president at that time told the FBI, Harry Truman, said, we need to clean this up. Told the FBI to clean that up. Ran the Klan out of the South pretty much, and this went to the North, but we'll talk about that another time. So here's the graph I was talking about. And this is from the American Medical Association. Now, just a little forerunner here. 2020, the American Psychiatric Association apologized for its racist practices in the past. 2021, the American Psychological Association came out and apologized for its racist practices in the past. And then social work came out with something apologizing for a lack of concentration on racism within its history. I think that was in 2021 also. And so you're starting to see these types of things take place. But if you look here, and this is, makes it rather difficult because I love this. I actually just put this in last night because we see the upstream problems where we have white supremacy, racism, classism, sexism on the extreme left there. And then we have the institutional structural drivers about that. And then we have the living conditions of people. Now, one of the things I talked to the provost about recently was that the West Side is the new frontier, I would say, for the university, because there's about 10-year difference in life and mortality rates between the East Side of San Antonio and the West Side of San Antonio. In other words, if you live on the West Side, in general, you're going to die earlier. And we'll talk about that a little bit in terms of health inequities. And so then you see risk behaviors, disease in industry. And one of the things I really want to know in terms of understanding evidence-based approaches is really community capacity building and community-based research, community engagement, because that's how we find out what the people are really saying and what's happening. And we don't just have race as a dummy variable or 1-0, but what is really going on? How do we code those things? How do we codify them? How do we operationalize them as researchers? And that's why qualitative research is so important. That's why backers of critical race theory says that the personal experiences of people are real and we should listen to them. Okay, so that's really the turf in terms of doing that. In terms of physical environment, Harriet Washington in her book, Medical Apartheid, talks about toxicity in Baltimore through lead paint and children eating chips, going to schools, bouncing off of walls, getting diagnosed. But really it was the lead in their blood, and that was done from research. And they found out copious amounts of lead was in the blood of these children in Baltimore from these old homes that they were living in. And so that's the turf needed that we need to engage in terms of understanding racism and doing something about the problem. So here is the American Medical Association's, which says racism is a threat to public health. And I really like this. It's an extensive piece that they have, but it talks about racism as a primary driver in terms of health equity and systematic and structural racism, unconscious bias, and the need for more medical research. And recognizing racism in terms of its systematic, cultural, and interpersonal forms, and support the development of policy to combat racism and its effects. Encourage government agencies to increase funding for research into epidemiology of risk and damages related to race and how to prevent or repair. George Floyd did a whole lot for us, really, in his death. And there's some silliness saying that, he knew he was going to be a martyr. Nobody wanted to die like that. That's just stupid. It was all happenstance. But my point is one, that was the biggest protest we ever had in history, whether you know it or not, in this country. And it was an international protest. And all types of things started happening, from a sports buff from ESPN going to HBCUs on Saturday doing college football, to NIH putting out money, more money about health inequities. And so that's where the turf is in terms of reducing structural racism and health inequalities. And here, this gets to really the Institute for Research on Race, Policy Studies, and Health Equity here at the U, which is a job or a thing that I took on. And in my contract to become the associate provost, it says 25% of my time is dedicated to this institute. and it'll be here in the College of Social Work, but it's not a social work institute. It's an institute for the entire university for both campuses. And so we'll start to go to work on that and start to look at grant formation, and we'll start to tackle some of the health inequities in this area. The guys I wrote this with said, let's make it about critical race theory. I'm like, that's not going anywhere. Okay, you can talk about it after we get the center started. But first, let's make this a real, and so what we did was we looked at the Utah database. Utah has this excellent database on health. And what it showed was these trajectories by 2065, there still only be 2% African Americans in Utah, okay? So not much hope there. But the trajectory of health outcomes for our Latinx brothers and sisters and for African Americans is detrimental in terms of cardiovascular disease, in terms of diabetes, in terms of high blood pressure, in terms of kidney disease. All of those, the trajectories show problems. And so what we said to President Ruth Walkers at the time is actually we want to save Utah a lot of money by examining health equities and trying to solve them. And that's going to be tough if we, go back to this other piece here because of all the things, because we really have to convince people to do what? Remove themselves from risk factors. Me and my wife are always arguing about what we eat in the morning. And I'm at the stage where I can't eat bacon and eggs. And I smell it when I get up. It smells so great. But when I go to the doctor, it's like, Martell, we talked about this. And so I said, could you talk to my wife? And she's such a sweetheart. She has breakfast ready for me. But I had to start eating oatmeal and cereal and fruit. And I'm actually losing weight. That's a great thing, isn't it? Anyway, enough about me. Anyway, here you see the centers for ethnicity and poverty centers across the country. You see most of them are clustered on the East Coast. And if you look here in our region where we're at in Utah, there's nothing. The closest thing we have is in Colorado. We have something in Albuquerque in New Mexico, and then all the way to the West Coast. So let's hope this center puts us on the map. And one of my goals would try to talk to all these people from these centers on how we collaborate together and do work nationally. How about that? And you can be involved. So here is the book itself and the chapters. Here's part 1, which is on history, racism, and social work education. Now, initially, the Grand Challenge Executive Committee, which I'm a part of, and there are several people there that have been elected to that executive committee that will work on this, and really bright people that's doing some really great research, and I'm so glad to see them because we were kind of stuck in the mud for a while. And it's kind of like, if I don't do anything, nothing will happen, but we got to get other people involved. But anyway, they said, just make it the grand challenge to eliminate racism, take social work out. And I said, no, we got to first start with ourselves. We have to first internally look at the profession and what we're doing before we can go out to the rest of the world, even though we're doing both of these at the same time, of course, which is how research works. But we need to do this. We need to say the grand challenge to eliminate racism and the social work grand challenge to eliminate racism. Then that brings me to the whole notion of eliminating racism. What do you mean you're going to eliminate racism? And what I said to Dean Osteen during the interview, which I hear is the podcast is coming out tomorrow, okay, is that what if the American Medical Association and the American Oncology Association, Jen Nazar was there also, had a press conference and said, we spent over $1 trillion on cancer research, and we're not getting what we thought. We need to just end this. They would be fired. Because what we know, one, we've made progress on cancer, and two, it's not just based on what's going on in this generation. We have to advance those studies over time. Racism is the same way. It's not going to happen in my lifetime. And my challenge to all of you is, what are you going to do? And what will you do? First, let's start with our interpersonal life. And so when goofy things are said in my house, I go, hey, let's kind of tone that down, Let's take another approach and look at the person from another lens. You see? Because all people do these things. So what are you going to do in your careers, in your interpersonal life, and in your research? because we're at a point in our country where conversations about race are one thing. The actuality of doing something is another. No one has to feel guilty necessarily. Only you feel guilty when you don't do anything, when you have the ability to do something. And so for me, being here in Utah, and people are always trying to get me out of there, believe me. And they're going, what are you doing there? And then one thing I said when I came here is I'm going to continuously be myself. And I've always been a scholar who talked about race. And so I'm going to articulate that when I go to the University of Utah. And that's the way I sleep at night. And when I was talking to the president, I told him several things. We need to do this. You need to put money in this research. And you need to fund this institute because Utah needs it. Okay, so the first part of it talks about the history of social work and does chapter 3. A good friend of mine from Howard University is an excellent writer on professional narratives of it as a technique for teaching social work students about the complexities of racism. She is great. And we see those topics there. And then here we see part 2 is about racism and individual well-being in terms of health development for youth. There's a project in Washington, state of Washington, that's taking place that looks at psychosis amongst youth and preventing them. And they're doing evidence-based approaches to that. They're hooked up with some folks in Colorado doing some research. So it's really promising. And this piece on settler colonialism actually talks about evidence-based approaches to ameliorating health inequities. And then we have integrating the association, the American Association of Social Work and Social Work Grand Challenges to Productive Aging. There's actually racism in aging and social isolation. Lots of prisoners, people who are in prison, and people who have went to war become isolated and don't want to deal with other people. It's actually me sometimes because of what they've seen in war. Prisoners do that also from being in solitary confinement. Racism isolates people, and it isolates young people over time. And the research shows if you start engaging in social isolation at a young age, that's where you may end up in terms of being an elder. And so there's a movement to try to do something about that. Colorism, that's a huge issue there. I've got about 5 more minutes. That's a huge issue in terms of how we look at each other. That goes back to race as more than just a social construct, because we sum people up based on the color of their skin. Goofy thing to do, humans. If I was God, I'd be like, you guys are really kind of, goofing it up. He'd include me too, or she or they would include me too. Just got to watch it. But you understand my get. The colorism is there's a whole, and there's empirical research done out of University of Illinois on colorism. Okay. And then confronting racism against Asian Americans in the US. Another scholar from from Howard University wrote that chapter. Then there's part 3, eliminate racism through strengthening the social fabric. Then that gets to environmental racism in terms of its problems with people. And then actually, African Americans are disproportionately homeless in every state in the union. Now, our Anglo-American brothers outnumber, but disproportionately, 12% of the population, they represent about 33% of the people homeless in this country. And at one time, 50% of our veterans who were homeless were African Americans. I lived in one of those communities where these racialized structural things happen, where a judge would say, hey, Martell, not me though, but somebody, that's not how I ended up in the military. Okay, I just want to show you. But he would say, hey, you can go to jail or you can go to the military, literally. And that was just happening. Now, a lot of these people had mental health problems already. That's why they were standing in front of the judge. And then they took them to Vietnam and brought them back. And you can imagine what their lives were like after that. And then we talked about social isolation and social exclusion again. There's only 3 chapters in part 3. Then we have part 4 here, which finishes us off. Actually, I participated in chapter 16, Juvenile Justice and Achieving Equal Opportunity and Justice, which really looks at the disproportionality. Emily's here, who used to be my RN, RA, research assistant. She helped create a website. It's still going, Emily. That website is still up and running. But we look at the disproportionality of children being expelled and suspended from school. And in every state in this country, African Americans are disproportionately suspended from school and expelled from schools. For small, the research shows that bias plays a huge, and presuppositions about people and racial common sense thinking plays a huge part in that. And then my friend Jerome Shealy writes chapter 20 on white supremacy and American social policy, and he talks about a race-centered perspective, again, as I talked about. And then you see the last chapter there. Here's my references, and I really want to thank all of you. Time for question and answers. Yes.
Thanks for being part of this. Yeah. This happened in today's classroom.
Yes.
Teaching macro macro.
Yeah.
The comment so many of my students made was macro feels so overwhelming, so daunting, so hopeless. And there are so many factors. So how do we, as a college, as new social work students, keep macro and racism in our viewpoint without getting discouraged by lack of progress?
Thank you for that question. And it's my belief, and I'm glad you brought that up because it's something, yes. Okay, what the speaker was saying is that it's just in class, and there was discussion about micro and macro social work, understanding that they go hand in hand. But the students were saying that this macro portion is just so overwhelming and just too much to kind of absorb. How do you eat a whole elephant? Someone heard me say that before, one bite at a time. But what I really would like to say to you is that I think curriculum needs to be revised in this program and many other social work education programs. I was the department chair at the University of Texas at San Antonio, and they had the best curriculum I've ever seen because it's micro, meso, and macro all the way through. Now, the only drawback is that the students did not have many electives. They only had like 2 electives they could choose from their graduate program. But they got a healthy dose of macro social work right off top. That was part of it. Now, social work needs to change itself in general. And that's something I say in the book, to include micro, meso, and macro. Why? Because the problem, as we saw in that graph, is upstream, you see. And we're dealing with people in clinical situations. And this really goes back to the 1940s when there was a shortage of psychiatric social workers, when people were coming back from World War II with huge amounts of mental health problems. The federal government funded large, copious amounts of social work. And if you read the history of social work education here in this college, it was the time when they laid off people because the government one day just said, oh, we're cutting that. We don't need that anymore. And so they had to lay off massive amounts of people. That got us into clinical licensure. And when social work students come to programs, the highest, the zenith of being a social worker is what? An LCSW, which is clinical. Nothing wrong with that, but a good dose of macro social work needs to be a part of that. My gut thing to students is that this is college, and it is hard, and it's challenging. And that's okay. And so that's fine. Let me walk you down the road. How do I work with you to have you understand what's going on? But I think that's important to do across the board, is infuse micro, meso, and macro in social work education programs. It can be done. And I would like the Council on Social Work Education to change its standards to do that. I only know of a handful of programs that do that. I think Connecticut does that, right? Yes, I did a lecture there once, so Connecticut does that. So Elise knows what I'm talking about. Okay, I hope I answered your question. Are there others? Are there questions from the audience? That's it. I got off easy on this one. Yes. Sure. So we have some pillars under that institute. And I think one of them is education, justice, and policy formation, health equities. And so I think there are 4 pillars there, and I can't remember all of them. What we're doing is we have at least a group of 10 researchers in each area that come together throughout the university from the main campus and the health science campus. And what we'll do is work on grants and grant funding to try to ameliorate some of these problems. There are grants out there, and you know, I think we've missed a good window actually, because right after George Floyd, NIH and NIMH put out huge amounts of grants on health disparities, but they're still out there. And so it is to try to get some of that grant funding. And as any good former dean would do, if the institute doesn't work, then we sunset it after a few years. So that's part of the vision there, but it'll be housed here in social work, but it belongs to the university. Yes. Chris, how are you? Good to see you. So the question pertains to, there's a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion work taking place. Yes. Sure there is. Similar to the climate surveys we do here in the College of Social Work. Organizations should do that to understand their organizational culture and if they're doing what they're doing is effective. This is one of the challenges I have with our relationship with neighborhood partners. They do great work. They do very little evaluation of what they're doing. And so that has to change, because when I was dean, they said, could you give us more resources? And I go, no, you have to provide some evidence of what you're doing, and then maybe we'll think about resources. But that's corporations need to do. It cannot be kumbaya, feel-good therapy. We need to attract a few Blacks or Latinx folks. It has to be program and practice. Someone asked me here, could you help recruit more African Americans here? And I go, why? And they were stunned. See, people are not widgets. So what would I say to them? Why do you need to come to Utah? What's about the culture? What about employment? What about in schools? What about your existence within a community? What about your own values and cultural mores? How are those answered here? Because those are the people that I know that will ask those critical questions. It's not as simple as inviting someone here. Hope that gives you something. But the climate surveys are important to do, to get corporations to do. And a good one will do that. Throughout the corporation, design it uniquely for its own entity. Dr. Castillo? Did I see, Jen, did you have a question? Was there? Okay, Dr. Castillo? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good question. That goes back to Emily's question. It should be the Intermountain region. We start at Utah, but we should be looking at the entire Intermountain region and trying to attract others. Okay, I have a question here. Were there any experiences while at VCU on the East Coast that shaped some of the work you have continued to expand upon in the Midwest? Yes, that's the simple answer. But I was one of 2 African-American males in the MSW program. And I noticed that there was nothing about me in the curriculum, nothing about African-Americans, and it was a strictly mainstream curriculum, all the books. Of course, there was text on race and ethnicity that we used, but it was very shallow, 8th grade stuff, okay? And so what I did was coalition build, and I'm coming right out of the military at that time, so I understand this whole notion. So what I did was I got our feminist scholars, our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters, our Latinx brothers and sisters, and we all wrote a letter to the dean. And I handed it to him, and it basically said, great program, doing great things, but we don't see these things in the curriculum, and you need to change. Little did I know they were about to go through reaccreditation. And so the dean said, Martell, we're going to go to a reaccreditation. And at that time, the Council on Social Work Education actually met with all minority students to see, and women, to see how they were doing. And so he's like, please, when you go, I promise to do something, but when you talk to them, you know, cut us some slack. And before that, I had ran for the president of the Student Association. So I was the president of the Student Association. And so I was meeting with the dean. And our first meeting with him after that, and we got through accreditation, it was a real diatribe, and everybody was complaining. He got up and walked out. And so I went to him and, what'd you do that for? He says, because you guys were just complaining. You didn't have any solutions. And I go, that'll never happen again. So we started to meet. And what we came up with was this ideal of a social justice day, you know, one day of social justice for all the students in the program. And I was using the language that we're going to shut down the school. And so I met with the dean and I went to one of the faculty meetings. And when I said that, you could see the faces. Like we can't, and an epiphany hit me right there. And I said to the faculty, we're actually not shutting down the school, we're opening the school to everyone. And so we put the whole thing on for a week. It was called Social Justice and Social Work, and it ran for 10 years. Until someone, you know, just, we need to stop doing this. And so that was my experience at Virginia Commonwealth University. And so I've always been an advocate for this. You know, what are you going to do? That's part of who Martell Teasley is. Okay. Anyone? I think I answered that. Yes. I can't what? I'll eat bacon and eggs in the morning. Okay.
As just, you know, inevitably, as part of your identity, professional and personal identity with your work, how do you take care of you to not burn out?
Great. First, I do cheat a little bit. My wife will go, there were 5 pieces there, only 4 now. I thought, I had an uncle they used to call Ghost because food would just disappear. And I didn't eat that pork chop. And my aunt said, there must be a ghost that lives here. So we started calling it Ghost. Taking care of myself, I've been on leave for a year. And I have been a couch potato, part of it. I sleep late and I watch movies at night. And that is fine with me. I have been burnt out before. And that's one reason I got out of nursing. And so you have to take time for yourself. And I will say that central administration is really challenging. And so after a year of that, the president said, well, could you please stay on? And I go, no, I am taking that leave. It's in my contract. And so that's part of it. The other thing that I fell into, particularly when I was in doctor education, I stopped going to the doctor as a former nurse. And healthcare practitioners are notorious for not following their own advice. And so I started to say, no, you're going to all your doctor's appointments. And so that's what I do now. I don't miss them. And I try to, and so I eat right. I try to exercise and take care of myself as much as possible. Jen, did you have a question? Okay. All right. One last question.
Do you think researchers should be doing to our minorities? Whether it's in protocol development or recruitment efforts or just ways of building trust?
Yeah, recruitment efforts need to be strong and not doing the same old thing. So part of, you know, working with the College of Social Work was diversifying it. And then the dean started to say to me, well, how do you do that? And I said, well, you have to recruit people. You have to look for them in different places. And they said, yeah, but, you know, we had a candidate and she was a Black female and then there was a white guy, but he was from Princeton and we wanted him. And I said, if you're looking in the same old places for the same old people, you're going to get the same thing. So I'm not impressed when we go hire all these people from Harvard, Princeton, and Yale because those structural inequalities aren't changing. You see? And so we have to stop looking in the same places for the same people because that becomes a part of racial common sense thinking. And so I'm so glad I went to Howard instead of Harvard. In fact, W. Du Bois and the father of Black history, Carter G. Woodson, said it took them 30 years to get Harvard out of them. So anyway, that was the last question. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Dr. Teasley and Martell. We were so grateful for your expertise and for your time here being and your mentorship and your support of the college. So thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Very much for being here for that. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. So for virtual attendees who are seeking continuing education hours, please watch your email in the coming days where you will get the links for the recorded presentation as well as the brief quiz. And after successfully completing the quiz, we will email you your CEUs. The College of Social Work is committed to taking the evidence generated through our research, not only to the future social workers sitting into our classrooms, but out into our communities. We hope that you will join us for our next event, which is held on Thursday, November 16th, when we will feature the innovative My Two Aunties program. You can find details about all of the events on the college's events webpage. And again, thank you for being a part of this event. Be kind, be safe, and do well. Thank you.
Appreciate you.
Great, man.
Thank you.